Well, thank you all for those presentations. I'm Bill Ritter and have the unenviable task of trying to pull all this together for the next half hour. It is April Fool's Day, so I feel like I could do a lot of things with these three panelists and chosen not to and instead try and take some kind of a serious vein. I do sort of feel like I should get some college credit. Part chemistry, part physics, part economics. It was just really fascinating presentations. We're going to do this a little different. We're going to try and save time. It says we have 45 minutes. I thought we just had 30. I don't think that clock's not right. Okay, so we just have 30. And I'm going to try and save some time for Q&A, but these were three very interesting presentations with, I think, three different perspectives. But the world that we live in energy transitions, which is what this is about, is really trying to understand, I think, the confluence among policy, finance, and technology. And I think there's a real way that those things sort of come together. And the three of you, interestingly, although you have different perspectives, had different parts of it that touched on a variety of things. And so I want you to think about this question. Like, if you were able to ask the other two panelists something that they may not have addressed, or to take it, another place, what would that be? And I'm going to start, Connor, with you asking Eric a question. And it really is, the world that you live in. You said we can only go so far, and after that, the private sector will take over. Here's a group of people who care a lot about impact investing, I would call it, and you saw their number one thing was climate. What do you think is the thing you would like to see them do in the private sector that could make the kind of impact that would take over from where the federal government is, where the Department of Energy is presently, in commercializing an all of the above strategy?
Sure. First off, great boots, great footwear, Governor.
Are they Lucchese's?
Yeah, they are mine. I think we have the same boots, actually.
So too.
Well, thank you again for having us up here, and that's a huge question because it's at the crux of really a lot of what we do, because we haven't seen too many breakthrough energy venture-like things before, if ever. And so it's a pretty simple question, but it's something that we've teed up once before, which is, how far apart are we? You've been on this side when you worked at the Department of Energy, and you now are out there really putting it to work and doing it. So how far apart do you think we are?
I think it's a great question, and it's a great point. There is still a distance, and I think it's a relatively large distance. I often tell people that I feel at Breakthrough that we're sort of halfway in between ARPA-E and Kleiner-Perkins. But that's still a big distance, and I think that we need to be imaginative in the way that we fund these things. I think there are a lot of public-private partnerships where public sector dollars can pay down risk and encourage private sector investors to invest earlier than they would have done. And so I think that we have a great opportunity to explore some of these unique partnerships to get money in earlier stage.
And I think that's important, the uniqueness, because when we talk about traditional mechanisms, look, it's no secret, the traditional mechanisms don't get it done. And one of the things we're working hard at the department right now is it's very easy to use TRL, technology readiness levels, as a judgment of where you should put your money. And when you start doing that, it kind of perverts the idea of putting a concrete measurement on a very liquid tech maturation cycle that varies depending on what technology it is. And so there's not a concrete mechanism and a clear handoff, no matter how much policymakers want that to exist. And so what can we do to help invent a new mechanism, a new way of doing it?
And again, I think funding mechanisms that involve cost sharing are a great way to do that. And we did some of that at ARPA-E. I think we could do a lot more. I think that's so there are a number of things that you can do in there. I think another piece of this that you don't want to forget is the enormous amount of money that's required to scale these things after they've finished. the consequence in energy, things don't scale the way that iPhones or apps do, right? And so once you've demonstrated a technology, perhaps even at a pilot scale, and now, now the next thing you need is $1 billion to try and scale it. And so where does that money come from, right? That's not something that venture can do. In many instances, it's still too early in the development cycle for private equity to do. That's a real challenge. So I don't think we should forget the other piece of that as well.
So where does it come from? Because I think that is the question. I mean, your first...
Sure, and so I think that there are some very interesting opportunities. In some geographies, there are public sector dollars that are available to do those kinds of things. I think there are things like pension funds. We've seen a lot of interest in the stuff that we're doing from pension funds, the larger pension funds, national pension funds, teacher pension funds, things like that.
Sovereign funds.
So there are a number of those kinds of funds that have this sort of powder to do this kinds of things. Perhaps we need changes in the tax codes to convince them to invest in those spaces. But I think we're going to have to really be imaginative and think out of the box.
So Eric, now you're going to switch hats to be the questioner.
Okay.
Your question is going to go to Amory. When Breakthrough was first announced, there was some criticism by individuals saying, we don't need new technology, we need to deploy technology that's presently there. One of the things that Amory said in his presentation was actually, we have a lot of the right technology, we need to design it differently. And so I'd like you two to have a bit of a conversation about what we really do need. Do we need, is there a role for Breakthrough? And if it is, in Amory's mind, what might that be?
So I agree very much with Amory. I think that technology can turn into a fetish. And I think you have to be very careful to avoid that. I think, so I've started a number of companies myself. I've done technology. I think you do technology when you don't have any other alternative, right? Because it's very, very, very hard to do. And so we're very interested in investing in new business models, for instance, that allow us to deploy existing technologies in ways that they haven't in the past. But I'd like to ask Amory about some of the impediments to deploying many of the technologies that you talked about today, because there are a whole bunch of those impediments that make it very difficult to deploy some of those things at scale.
Well, let's start with the really simple one, that energy is invisible and the energy you don't use is almost unimaginable. And yet, gains in energy productivity or reductions in energy intensity since 75 are 30 times as big as the growth in renewables in the same period. All power to renewables. I'm delighted they're doing what they're doing, but they're highly visible. You can see them on the rooftop or the skyline, and they get 99% maybe of the headlines, and I think most of the investment attention. So I'm glad you guys are investing in some stuff on the demand side. But I think the first big obstacle is people don't realize what efficiency can do. You might be surprised even that even counting only as a modest part of the integrative design potential, we worked out in Reinventing Fire how to quadruple the efficiency of using electricity in the US by 2050 at historically reasonable rates of deployment and costing about 1/10 the retail rate. That's a huge overhang of unbought efficiency, which would make most of the supply side proposals unnecessary and uneconomic. There are 60 or 80 well-known market failures in buying efficiency. You can look on the web for climate making sense and making money, and on pages 11 to 20, I think you'll find a nice list of them in a column corresponding to the business opportunity each one can be turned into. So that alchemy of stumbling blocks into stepping stones, which we also call barrier busting, ought to be a top priority for policy, but seldom is. There are two particularly important policies that could be done nicely at a state level, but are not yet common enough. One is rewarding utilities for cutting your bill, not for selling you more energy, like decoupling and shared savings. So we do that now in 17 states for electricity, I think 26 or something for gas, but the rest still have perverse incentives. Second would be feebates for buying new cars. So that means when you buy a new car, you pay a fee or get a rebate, which and how big depends on how efficient it is. The fees can pay for the rebates. It can be revenue neutral, size neutral, but it means that the private buyer can adopt a societal discount rate and take account of society's many interests in very efficient vehicles. It's very powerful. It's working in about 6 countries. It's time we did it here. And I think if the courts uphold, which I kind of doubt, avoiding the California waiver on CAFE standards, that'd probably drive California to adopt feebates, which would be more efficient than what we've got now. So, you know, be careful what you wish for.
So doesn't the California low carbon fuel standard operate that way already, where there's both a disincentive on the part of fossil fuel producers who have to buy the allocations and an incentive on the part of the low carbon fuel cars who have the opportunity, and it's all point of sale, so the customer is actually not involved in that at all?
Yeah, and it's a very powerful push me, pull you thing, and one of the best interventions we could have. It's actually similar to the core of a suite of policies that has made 1/3 of new vehicles in Norway plug-in electrics of various kinds, which is, I think, 23 times our share. Policy does matter. So, unfortunately, I don't think there's a way for you to invest in policy companies, and it's difficult to invest perhaps in design companies, but I'm curious, both of you emphasize technology a lot. I really wonder what you would do to speed up the adoption of the arrestingly simple design methods I propose that can be so powerful, so lucrative, but there are a lot of obstacles between the ears.
So this was my next effort here, was to have you ask Connor a question. This is Amory's turn.
Yeah.
Sure.
I'll just tell you, Connor, anytime Amory, in my public life, he's asked me questions my whole public life. When I was on the stage, and I always began my answer by praying that I understood the question well enough to have
Did you
a
see
decent
that in my
answer to it. So
I saw it coming. It was a
Amy's
slow,
asked you a
it was a
question,
slow burn.
yeah.
Slow burn. No, so I think the efficiency, not to revert back to the name of our biggest applied office at the Department of Energy, the EERE, the Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office. Energy efficiency being a huge part of what the office does, and working on designs through that office, I think, is a great way of doing it. As the Chief Commercialization Officer, not to punt, because I'm not on that, my responsibility is, hey, look, Congress tells us what dollars are going to be spent on what research, and then I'm the back-end support there to help that research go to the next level. But as far as design mechanisms, I think there's plenty of wiggle room with those dollars that go to our Better Buildings Office, our Advanced Manufacturing Office, our Vehicle Technology Office, that can support design research in order to
if you
move
drill down
towards
one more
implementation.
level, though, what
Sure.
do they actually do? For example, the main design software used to lay out HVAC systems and industrial piping does not allow diagonal or curved piping. It requires orthogonal pipe layouts, neat right angles, because that was easy to draw before the computers did the drawing. And there ought to be a toggle in the software to let you go not orthogonal, because it'll save a lot of money, because in pipe layout, ugly is beautiful. Another thing we're doing besides working with those software houses is pedagogy. Last week I was teaching Stanford's top 40 energy students, but I'd rather teach professors from all over the world and send them home with the materials, because that's a scaling model. We're looking for scaling models. I'm working with a very large company that's terrific at energy efficiency, but doesn't do low friction pipe layout, and it's in the chemical business, so they got a lot of pumps. And I wonder how we could leverage the DOE outreach. It's kind of like extension service. You got really good people doing that. Can we use their large surface area to spread these design methods?
Well, sure, and I'll say 2 things on that. One, which is, some of it is a mindset change, right? That we're going to talk about designs in a different way than we do right now. But specifically, I can talk to, as I mentioned, I was previously at RPE. RPE is working on a controls and designs program, right? That fundamentally changes the way and that's more of a grid overlay look rather than at the micro level of a building, but more of a macro look. But really looking at how we look at design, because the curveball in all of this is, as we all know, and was mentioned in multiple speeches, look, we've still got to remodel this plane while we fly it. Mm-hmm. We can't shut it off, redesign the whole system to what probably makes sense. We have to work with what we have now and adapt it. And so finding ways to successfully do that and to push and to motivate a design thought, I think is perfectly within DOE's
well, I want to give a shout out also to the Defense Department and particularly the Navy, not only the leader within our government in deploying renewables, but also changing the rules on efficiency. In Defense Science Board in '09, we got the rules changed so that saved energy would be, especially saved fuel, would be valued according to what it costs to deliver it to the platform in theater in wartime. They had valued it at what it cost to put it in a big tank somewhere in a rear area, kind of a wholesale price. It turned out that it's really worth on the order of 10 times, maybe more, like 100 times in some cases, more than that. And I knew we'd succeeded when I met a guy at a military airframe maker some years later who was designing a new efficient airplane. I said, how do you value saved fuel? He said $134 a gallon, because that's what it costs to deliver it in midair in theater when you count all the pyramid you can avoid. Well, that's going to be a very different airplane, and that technology then seeps back into our civilian aviation, and the same in all sectors. The civilian sector uses over 50 times more energy than the military, so I like that leverage.
So I'm going to transition a little bit and talk about state policy, and I think you all three probably have some perspective on that. We had elections in November. 9 separate governors ran on a promise or a commitment of some kind of 100% clean and renewable in the next couple of decades, even a little more than that. States are moving this. New Mexico just passed a package where it's a big renewable energy standard plus a whole climate action that the governor is doing. Governor of Nevada is looking at 50%. Our governor's talked about 100% renewable, has not yet unveiled all the ways that he'll get there, but he's going to have a couple of folks who are on his cabinet here later today. I'm going to start with you, Eric, and just ask you this question. What's that mean to you in terms of investment or even investment certainty, that while there may be some things slowing down or even pulling back at the federal level, states are making this move toward clean and renewable in a pretty serious way?
I think it's really exciting, and I think one of the nice things about having the states do it is it's an opportunity to build interesting laboratories where we have a slightly different take on how to do things as we go. And so we can try a number of different approaches. I think that there's great opportunities to work with state agencies, with state governments, to better understand the needs of the technologies that we're developing, and to use those locations as test beds for the technologies.
Just sort of as a finer point on that, you actually have a group inside of Breakthrough that's working on policy and specifically state policies.
The Breakthrough Energy Coalition, right? So that was the piece that was first announced by Bill in 2015. Breakthrough Energy Ventures is a financing arm, but the coalition piece that's led by Jonah Goldman is very involved in the policy side of things, both at the national and state level and also at the international level. We have an office in Washington that's run by Mike Boots. And so we're very active in that space.
And Connor, I don't want to really put you on the spot. I think, no one person in the federal government's an apologist for everything that happens in federal government. There's been a lot, I think, that people sort of think about climate change would disagree with the Trump administration. But what's your take on the interplay between the kinds of things you do in commercialization and the state's efforts around policy making that's going to likely push commercialization of clean energy technologies a lot more quickly than it may other kinds of things?
Well, I think when we look at how the states are interacting, it's no secret that we're not huge into behavioral changes, forced behavioral changes that is, or incentives necessarily, but we are excited about competition. And when you see states that have taken up different mantles and different strategies to go after things, that's more power to them. Let's see how the process works out, and we want to encourage that. And from my seat as the Chief Commercialization Officer, we want to put as many tools into those hands to experiment, and if they are going to be more malleable and more forward-leaning in certain areas, let's enable them to take that Department of Energy technology that has been funded by the U.S. taxpayer and see how far they can run with it. So we want to maximize those opportunities to really let the competition thrive.
It's interesting that in Texas, and a lot of it under now Secretary Perry's leadership, Texas became by far the national leader in wind power, but also interestingly under Pat Wood, when he ran the PUC of Texas, they unbundled all the ancillary service prices, from which you can now find out that balancing the intermittence of big thermal stations is several times as expensive as balancing the predictable variability of say, wind farms, except that the thermal station balancing has always been socialized invisibly as an inevitable system cost, but renewables get charged for their balancing costs, and that asymmetry needs fixing, but we only discovered it because Texas made markets in this stuff. And that's how we learn the importance of the 9 non-storage grid flexibility resources that are actually bigger and much cheaper than batteries.
Which is, that's a huge example that is very very close to the Secretary's heart, because he's very proud
Rightly so.
at the amount of energy, the amount of wind energy in particular that Texas produced. I mean, he brags that it's more than all but 5 countries in the world in Texas. What's the missing link there? Storage. And with that, we've reflected that in the spending priorities through the department, that we've really pushed new and innovative storage
Well, Bloomberg
research.
just announced that in the last year, cost of lithium-ion batteries has fallen 35% on top of 37% the previous year. Yeah. But again, there's 9 cheaper ways to do the same thing, so let the competition roll.
And remember, one of those ways is transmission, and the federal government clearly has a big role to play in that space as well.
That's right. So we have about 15 minutes. I think we're going to go to questions from the audience, and I'm going to take the questions and then decide who probably will answer them. Maybe that's the way we'll do it. Yes, sir. There's a microphone coming.
I guess unlike candidate Hickenlooper, I'm not ashamed to say I'm not a capitalist. So my question is to policy. And you're describing there's no appetite for additional pricing for renewables. Doesn't that ignore the enormous subsidies to fossil fuels, particularly the existential threat that they present?
I don't know if that's who that's. I mean,
Anybody can take it. Amory, I think, has an answer to it. I do too.
Yeah, I think also if you're going to add existential threats, national security is always an existential threat as well, and that can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. The administration puts a huge value on our reliability and resiliency and how it affects our national security. So I think that's also a price point that if you are going to add all in, I think that needs to be considered as well. And I'm not sure how that off balances or not. I'm not going to claim that I've done that work as an economist, but I think you have to add that in as well.
All energy pretty much is subsidized. The subsidies to fossil and nuclear tend to be very long-standing, usually permanent, and very opaque. And there isn't a modern, an up-to-date, comprehensive analysis of them, but there should be for all technologies. And I would then like to get rid of all the subsidies so that we pay for energy at the meter and the pump and not through our taxes. So imagine how this might work. Perhaps there's a future hearing I was dreaming the other night where, say, Senator Markey is chairing an inquiry and he asks the sworn energy executives, Mr. Jones, it looks like your industry got $11.3 billion last year from this new government analysis we did from federal subsidies. Mr. Smith, your industry got Senator, those aren't subsidies. Oh, so you wouldn't mind if we took them away, would you? That's how you know if they're subsidies.
I'm going to take the moderator's perspective, or the moderator's prerogative, and turn the question on the head a little bit, because I am probably a capitalist of sorts, but I think the thing you're talking about in some respects can be answered with a market-based solution. So I served on this panel for the National Academy of Sciences, and the question was how to accelerate the adoption of cleaner energy technologies. And one of the things the group talked about was pricing carbon as a market solution. So if you really want the market to function in a more perfect way than it currently does, you have to capture externalities, and that's something we don't do. And it also addresses this existential threat of greenhouse gas emissions causing climate change. And we had people from Congress tell us not to put a recommendation in there about pricing carbon, or the report would be dead on arrival. Representative Joe Burton from Texas said specifically that. And we said, we're not the National Academy of Political Scientists, we're the National Academy of Scientists, and the National Academy is already out there in a couple of places saying kind of the purest way to really address capturing this externality and using market forces to really make the market purer would be to price carbon, however you do it, with a cap and trade, cap and dividend, a fee or tax on carbon. And so I think that you don't have to be something that's non-capitalist to really look at this and say there is a way to address this, and there's a way that a lot of people have agreed. What's really interesting about this is the pivoting that I think is happening in the United States Senate. And Lamar Alexander gave a speech from the well of the Senate last week where he talked about climate change, talked about it being real, talked about it being human-caused, and then laid out what he called the need for a Manhattan Project. In part, this is responding to the Green New Deal, but the need for a Manhattan Project of that scale, something a lot of our speakers have talked about, to really try and address this existential threat, but do so in a way that we as Americans and as innovators can be responsible in leading around the country. Questions?
Here.
Yes,
KK
Dee.
DeVivier, University of Denver. This question, China has been called the villain, and some people are saying it's now becoming a hero. I know one of the things it has done is mandate electric cars, but I'd like to hear from Amory and any other panelist about what China's doing and what the U.S. might be learning from China now.
Yeah, and there's quite a good paper on this in Nature, I believe, about 4 or 5 days ago. So because our steering committee for Reinventing Fire, China was basically the energy authors of the 13th five-year plan. It strongly influenced that plan. They're, I believe, a bit ahead of schedule on efficiency gains, and of course leading the world in the pace of efficiency gains in a big economy, as well as in renewables, nuclear, big hydro, and a bunch of other stuff. I think that is shifting. Nuclear's lost its policy gloss in China as they discover the costs, but the pace of renewable development is just extraordinary. In 2013, China added more photovoltaic capacity than the U.S. had added the previous 59 years since we developed it. 2016, they doubled the pace to 3 football fields an hour. 2018, I believe in the month of June, they put in more solar capacity than we put in all year. We got a lot of catching up to do. We do it in a very different way, and I'm happy to live in a market and not a centrally planned society. Everybody does it different ways. But the people running this policy are a very high quality, and they take it deadly seriously, both climate and the inability to breathe in polluted cities. That really gets your attention.
And there's no doubt that China is leading the way in many of those technologies. A lot of that intermittent energy is now, of course, being curtailed because of the lack of storage. So that's a piece there as well. But I'd also consider remind people that you need to look at the overall, the big picture, the amount of construction in China today, right? The amount of concrete and steel that's being deployed is absolutely enormous. And again, issues with diet and consumption of meat, things like that, are also having enormous impacts as well.
And I think there's some issues having to do with what they're doing to externalize their own, production. They're building a lot of things around the world. If you look to sub-Saharan Africa, the number of things that they have bought there in the way of assets there, the amount of activity there, and whether they're paying as much attention to CO2, to greenhouse gas emissions from that activity as they are inside of China is an open question.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I'd add to that as well, and we're human rights for that issue when they do those exact same things. I think good and bad. They're doing good and bad in two different totally areas,
Absolutely.
right? When it comes to how we kind of foot stomped responsibly open up our doors at the DOE to innovators. You know, that responsibly is an important word there, because there is not always the purest of efforts going on to gain our intellectual property, our innovative dollars. The money spent by the U.S. taxpayer needs responsible protection that we can balance correctly. And when I say that, we're not trying to choke it off. If we go through the wickets and realize that this is great technology, it does no good for the U.S. taxpayer to choke it out and say it's either here or nowhere. But it also doesn't do the maximum good for the U.S. taxpayer to just let it proliferate as fast as possible wherever without giving it the old college try to do it here in the United States to try to create U.S. jobs, U.S. competitiveness, and keep us at the forefront of technology and innovation.
My outfit has 24 Chinese staff members in Beijing helping the public and private sectors implement Reinventing Fire China. So we have some insight into that. Their biggest step is going to be economic dispatch, and I think that will come fairly soon in State Grid and Southern Grid. But there's a lot more we have to learn from each other because brains are evenly distributed, one per person. And more broadly, the majority of the world's investment in renewables is now in developing countries. It's not just China. The unsubsidized renewables are winning everywhere. And I think that's going to be a huge boost to what we do, both technically and politically.
I would put a plug in here for a book written by a woman out of the Tufts, the Fletcher School at Tufts. She and I are on a board together at the Energy Foundation. Her name's Kelly Sims Gallagher, and she's written a book called The Climate Titans. And it really is about trying to maintain a relationship with China as we figure out issues around climate change and trying to maintain a trade relationship with China as a part of working together and it's, I think, a lot what you've done, Amory, and a lot what the Energy Foundation has tried to do with its work in China.
And she's the lead author of that new Nature paper.
Yep. Questions? Yes, sir. Max, you're about to get a microphone.
Okay. And I have a question for Eric. You said you invested in Commonwealth fusion systems. How far away do they think their technology is from commercialization?
So it depends what you mean by their technology. So Commonwealth Fusion Systems, Dennis White at MIT, and they're using advanced magnetics that, if successful, will allow the construction of much smaller devices. One of the things that we liked about that investment is that there are a number of non-nuclear opportunities for these advanced magnetics. So if you mean how far away are we from using their advanced magnetics in, for instance, medical imaging devices, things like that, those are not far away. Those are 5 years away, maybe less than 5 years away. If we want to think about fusion generating power, that's considerably further out.
Yeah, the right place for a fusion reactor, in my view, is 150 million kilometers. It's free, it's well engineered. It's fascinating physics, so a physicist, I like to learn more about it, but the economics are pretty daunting. That's why smaller might be interesting. If you could take a combined cycle plant and take away the gas turbine up front and use the packaged boiler, steam turbine generator, maybe that's cheap enough to compete with something, but I doubt it. The problem here is that, say, in today's fission reactors, 2/3 of the prohibitive capital cost is the non-nuclear components. So if the nuclear stuff and the steam were all free, it would still be out of the money by several fold. So you've got to think of a very different approach if you want a steam cycle to be economically interesting for power.
Eric, at one point in time, Bill Gates was investing in a company, Terra Power. It was looking at developing, I think, low waste, even trying to
It's
develop
traveling
no
wave
waste
reactor, right.
in China. What's the status of that right now?
That has returned to the United States, and they're trying to figure out a path forward.
Okay, so abandon China, back to the United States, path forward, and I think one of the impediments in the United States was the time it takes to license new technology and permit it and actually get it operational.
In
And
other words, the economics are very daunting.
That's Amory's exactly right. I mean, that's really the problem. It's that is absolutely the problem with nuclear is the economics.
Yeah.
right.
And let me just speak real quick to the regulatory action there, though, which is DOE has a wall between us and the regulators, but one of our jobs as the Office of Technology Transitions is to identify those things. And so we've worked with that, and we continue to work to make sure it's not 10 years and $1 billion to get a new reactor design through a particular regulator. So I think that's something that everyone's keenly aware of.
Yeah, and so I can tell you when I was governor, I had a conversation with Lamar Alexander and actually with then Senator Mark Udall after he was elected about small modular nuclear reactors. And that was kind of the hope that there would be some bipartisan support in the United States Congress for technology to fund the development of that, and they could be part of the solution. That did not happen.
Well, again, do the math that the current reactors are uncompetitive with modern renewables, even without subsidy, by many-fold. They'll be twofold even less competitive by the time you could build enough small modular reactors to make any difference. And you end up, when you look at what would have to happen with needing about a factor 12 to 24 lower cost than the early small modular reactors, the advocates say would cost about twice as much a kilowatt hour as today's reactors, because as a matter of physics, reactors don't scale down well. So I don't see how mass production is going to get you there. What we do have, though, is small modular renewables, which do scale down well and are decades ahead in capturing their own economies of mass production, so you never catch up. Future technology as time has passed.
With that, we're going to end this panel. Thank you all for your attention. Let's give a round of applause to our 3 keynotes this morning. Thank you all.